what's up guys? In this video I'm going to show you how I poured this tabletop epoxy onto this bar top here. Now this tabletop epoxy is something that you see used a lot when it comes to bar tops or countertops or just basically anything that needs to be super resistant to moisture. Basically this tabletop epoxy just creates a plastic coating that prevents a lot of that moisture from seeping down and affecting the wood. So this is the type of finish that was used for these particular bar tops. Now, I'll show you everything that I kind of did to prepare for this, how I figured out how much epoxy to use, and then I'll show you all the steps that I took for actually pouring the epoxy itself. Alrighty, let's get started. Alright, so I thought I'd start off just by showing you guys exactly what type of epoxy I'm going to be using. So for this particular pour, I'm going to be using some of this liquid glass super clear tabletop epoxy. Now, as you can see, it comes in two parts here. I've got my part A, which is my epoxy resin, and then I've got my part B, which is my curing agent. Basically, any kit that you're going to buy in this type of epoxy is going to come in this two-part system. So you're going to get two of these. Now, when it comes to purchasing epoxy, it's important to make note of what type of epoxy that you're going to be purchasing. Now, if you're doing something like this where you're applying some of this epoxy over top of this wooden surface, I'd recommend getting this tabletop epoxy just because I believe that's going to work best for this type of application. So just make note when you're purchasing that it says tabletop epoxy. Now, when you get the epoxy, read the instructions because the instructions will tell you exactly how to mix it, what ratio you need to mix it, and it'll just give you all of the helpful insights that you're going to need to make sure that you're going to have a smooth pour. Now, I've purchased 4 gallons of this particular epoxy because I got 2 of these bar tops I'm going to be pouring, and this is a 2-gallon kit, and then I have another 2-gallon kit back there somewhere. But basically what I want to show you now is how I figured out that I needed these 4 gallons of epoxy. I'll show you how to figure out, based on what you're going to be pouring, how to figure out exactly how much epoxy to purchase, and then how to figure out how much epoxy you need to mix up for each pour. Alrighty, let's go.
Okay guys, so I want to explain to you how I figured out how much epoxy I needed for this project initially. Now, I will say that after my first pour, I decided to change up the amount a little bit for the remaining pours, so stay tuned for that. But for now, to figure out how much epoxy you'll need, basically what you want to start by doing is taking some measurements of the size of whatever piece you plan on pouring. Now, in my particular example, one of my tops measured 98 inches long by 22.5 inches wide. Then you want to consider the thickness that you plan on pouring the epoxy. Now, my plan was to do 2 seal coats and then a final flood coat, so 3 separate pours. The first 2 seal coats won't be quite as thick as the flood coat. Now, basically what we're going to do is figure out the volume of the pour in cubic inches. Now, the math here is pretty simple, but the quickest and easiest method is to head online and find an epoxy calculator and then just input your desired measurements. So, let's do that. I'll enter my length of 98 inches and my width of 22.5 inches. And then for my initial seal coat, the plan is to only do about 1/32 of an inch in thickness, so I'll enter that as well. And as you can see, it'll auto-calculate how many cubic inches are needed for this pour, as well as how many ounces or gallons will be needed. Now, knowing how many ounces is helpful for when it comes to mixing the epoxy, and it's also good to know the amount of gallons needed because most of the epoxy kits will be sold in gallons. So these epoxy calculators can be a really helpful tool for easily figuring out how much epoxy you'll need. So now that I know I'll need a total of about 39 ounces of epoxy for my first seal coat, I now need to figure out how much of part A and part B I will need to mix up. So fortunately, it's super simple to figure out with this type of epoxy because it has a 1-to-1 mixing ratio, which basically means that I can take that total of 39 ounces and simply divide it in half. After doing that, I now know that I'll need 19.5 ounces of part A and 19.5 ounces of part B. Easy enough. Now, if you're trying to figure out how much epoxy you need to purchase, just figure out how much epoxy is needed for each individual pour that you plan on doing, and then just total it all up. Now, it's always a good idea to get about 10% more in case something goes askew, which in all of my time working with epoxy, something always seems to, and I end up pouring a little more than I'd planned. So just purchase a little extra if you can. Now, there was a little prep work I had to take care of before I could pour epoxy. This included applying some polyurethane to the underside of the tops just to help seal it up some more. I decided to just use poly here to save on some epoxy. I also applied some plastic sheeting to the floors in my shop, which was crucial for keeping the epoxy drips off the floors. Lastly, I got the tops set in place and made sure they were nice and level and clean prior to pouring epoxy.
Okay, so it's time for me to mix up my first seal coat. Now, the reason I'm doing these seal coats is I'm trying to eliminate the amount of bubbles that are gonna come to the surface when I'm pouring the epoxy. The more seal coats you do, it just allows you to basically control those bubbles rather than pouring a thicker pour. Basically, for this first seal coat, what I'm gonna try to do is just pour enough to basically coat the surface, and that will hopefully seal off the wood, and that will hopefully eliminate as many bubbles coming to the surface. Now, there will be some, but doing multiple seal coats is just a way to help control that a little bit. So for this first pour, I'm just gonna be using these smaller mixing cups, just because I have a smaller amount of epoxy that I'm pouring. I did go ahead and label them part A and part B, and I'll pour them into separate cups, and then I'll pour them into one cup, and then I will mix that by hand. Now, you wanna try to mix this type of epoxy by hand slowly, because that is also going to help eliminate some of those bubbles. First up, we'll put on some of this little safety gear. I like to wear gloves because I don't like this sticky epoxy all over my hands. Now, you can also wear a respirator. I do that sometimes I don't. Now, I'm just gonna do one top at a time, I think. Especially for this first seal coat, to get an idea if this amount is gonna work out, and then if it does, then the next seal coat, I can do them both at the same time. But so this is telling me 19.5. Now, these are 8-ounce cups, so I'll have to do a couple pours at a time. So starting with my part A, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna be a good girl and also put on some safety glasses. All right, there's one 8-ounce. I'm gonna try to get as much of that out as I can. All right, I feel like I did pretty good with that. That's most of that out of there. All right, now I'm gonna grab my part B cup. So I'm gonna put my head on here, keep my hair out of my face. All right, now because this is that 1-to-1 ratio, I'm just gonna do that same amount of part B. This stuff isn't quite as thick. Now I'm gonna kind of mix this in as I pour it. Sorry, I just had a moment where I was like, is this too much? Oh, epoxies can be stressful. All right, so I got part A and part B in here, and now I just want to gently mix this by hand for about 5 to 7 minutes. Now, I know that can be tough because it's incredibly boring to sit here for 5 to 7 minutes just doing this, but it is important to get it mixed together well, and also by doing it by hand, like I said earlier, you're eliminating some of those bubbles. So I'm just gonna have Alexa throw some tunes on, and in about 2 songs, I'll be ready to put this on.
Now, the goal here is to mix it until it's a nice clear consistency. When you first start mixing, it will look kind of cloudy, so you just want to keep mixing until it clears up.
All right, that was 7 minutes of mixing. Now it's time to get this poured. Okay, so now that I have this first seal coat mixed up, I'm just gonna pour it along my piece here and then take this foam brush and just wipe it across. So let me get to pouring this. I'm gonna start small and add more as I need it. I think I'm gonna take this little scraper and kind of just spread it out first, and then I'll run over it with the foam brush. It's raining epoxy. Now this stuff is self-leveling, so it will self-level as it spreads. If you've watched any of my videos before, then you know that I usually have Murphy, my dog, in here with me just about all the time. This is one job that I would not let him work with me on, just because I can see him now walking in all of these epoxy drips everywhere, and I would never get the epoxy out of his fur. So he's sad that he couldn't be in here with me, but as soon as I get this wrapped up, he's got a bark box waiting on him, so that'll cheer him up.
A few moments later.
I did put that tape under these edges, but I will just kind of take my brush and catch any of these drips as I see them. For seal coat, I'm pretty happy with this. Now I know it's going to generate some bubbles. I can already see those bubbles. So now I'm going to take my heat gun and get to work on popping some of these bubbles. Now these bubbles are just a reaction from the epoxy off-gassing when it makes contact and seeps into the wood. So they're going to keep popping up as this process goes along. I'll keep kind of hitting it with the heat gun as much as I can, but I'm not going to stay down here for hours and hours doing this. Like I said, with this first seal coat, I'm not terribly worried about the bubbles because I'm just going to come through and sand those down. The main goal of this first seal coat, like I said earlier, is just to seal up the wood so that the next time and the next time and the next time, there's less and less of these bubbles. So I've let this first coat set up overnight and it's nice and hard now. There's definitely some bubbles here that I'm gonna have to address, but like I said before, I plan on sanding this thing down and doing a couple more coats. So I'm not too worried about those right now. Now, I do think for this first pour, I just poured a little bit more epoxy than I needed to. This was the amount that it told me to mix up for this seal coat that was supposed to be a 32nd of an inch in depth, but just when I was pouring it even, and now to look at it too, I think it's just a little bit more epoxy than I truly needed for a seal coat. So I'm gonna try something a little bit different for my other top. Rather than doing those same calculations to figure out how much epoxy I'm gonna need, all I'm gonna do is take the square footage of my other top, and then I'm gonna mix up about 1 ounce per square footage for this top over here. And that should hopefully just give me enough to basically just coat the surface. For my seal coats, that's really all I want to do. I just want to coat the surface so that I can help seal up that wood and then just try to help eliminate some of these bubbles. And then when it comes time to doing the flood coats, then I'm going to try to do about 3 ounces per square foot for these tops. Now I'll kind of feel it out as I go if I feel like I need to do more than that, but I am gonna start with a little bit less epoxy for this next go round, and just hopefully that'll help me waste a little bit less. So to get some of these bubbles and imperfections out, I'm just gonna hit this thing with my sander, and once I'm done sanding, just make sure that I get all of that dust off of here.
Now I ended up having to use a coarse grit on this initial sanding to really sand out those bubbles. But the nice thing about epoxy is that another coat of epoxy will completely hide all of the scratches generated from sanding.
Alright, so that was not fun at all. Basically what I had to end up doing was sanding quite a bit of this epoxy down because I had a lot of air bubbles that were trapped on one side of the piece and they just weren't sanding out. It's kind of ironic because earlier on in the video when I was talking about having some potential air bubbles and I said I didn't need to worry about that for right now, turns out I actually needed to worry about that. Because it required me to have to do a lot more sanding than I planned on doing, but I think I have it sanded down. I have most of the air bubbles either sanded out or I've come in and just popped them manually, and hopefully when I pour another coat of epoxy, it's just gonna fill that back up. But pretty much starting over with this piece now. It does have a very thin layer of epoxy on here now. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back and add another seal coat. This time I'm gonna try that tactic like I mentioned earlier of doing 1 ounce per the square footage of this thing. So I'm just gonna put a small coat this time on here and hopefully that'll be enough to seal it off and I won't get as many of those air bubbles. And if I do, maybe I'll spend a little bit more time popping them as I go. It's been about 6 hours since I poured that last seal coat and this thing is looking so much better than the first pour that I did. So I definitely think, in my opinion, using less epoxy here really helped eliminate some of those bubbles because especially like on this one that I just did my first seal coat on, using less epoxy on that one, I can totally tell that there's a lot less bubbles than there were on this one when I poured this one for the first time. So I definitely think I'm gonna stick with the 1 ounce per square foot for the seal coats, and then I'll do 3 ounces per square foot for my flood coats. But anyway, so these are looking pretty nice. Now I probably will come in and do 1 more seal coat. I'm really going for that ultra like glass-like finish. So I'm really trying to eliminate as many of these bubbles as I can before I get to my flood coat. Now, there is one more thing that I need to work on tonight before I can go to bed, and I've got these dimples here. There's a couple like little holes in this piece specifically, just like little holes that I didn't fill because I just assumed the epoxy would fill it up, but for whatever reason, the epoxy isn't filling them. At least it's not filling all of them, and it's creating these like little dimples here in the epoxy. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna mix up a smaller batch of epoxy, fill these holes in and let it set up overnight. That way tomorrow I can come in and just sand it smooth, and then hopefully that'll get all of these holes filled up and we'll be getting 1 step closer to doing our flood coat. Alrighty, well, I better get to work so I can get to bed. So as you can see, I overfilled a lot of these holes and now they are hard. So now I'm gonna do is just take my sander and sand those down flat with everything else. What do you guys think? Do you like what I've done with the place? So it's time to do my flood coat now, and basically because I plan on this being the last pour that I do, I don't plan on sanding this down and putting any more epoxy on it. I basically want to keep everything from getting into this epoxy because with this type of epoxy especially, I've noticed that little things will show a lot more and you know, it's a lot harder to get those things out unless you sand it down and pour another layer of epoxy. So to prevent things from getting in the epoxy, I've basically just created a little room here with some plastic sheeting, and that's hopefully going to keep a lot of things out of this epoxy. A lot of things like dust, dirt. I mean, my shop is not the cleanest. Let's be honest, a lot of dog hair in this place. So, and then the major thing I'm combating right now is just bugs. I don't know what it is about the bugs right now. I mean, it is summertime, but for some reason they love to fly into this epoxy. I've sanded so many bugs out of this on the previous seal coat, so I don't know if they have a death wish or what, but I've been getting a lot of bugs in the epoxy. So this is just to help combat some of that. All right, so for this flood coat, what I've done is I just prepared this. like I said, this is, I did 3 seal coats for this particular piece here, and that should have hopefully really sealed off this wood. That way when I pour this flood coat, the wood's not absorbing as much of that epoxy, which is gonna create a lot of those air bubbles. So I should get minimal air bubbles, and then if I do get some, I can pop those as I go. So this is nice and dust free. I made sure I got all of that epoxy dust off from sanding. So this is nice and clean. So that's another important thing to consider before you're doing your flood coat. And I've also made sure that I'm starting out with this thing pretty level. I have it on just about the most flat portion of flooring in my shop. And then anywhere that it was a little bit uneven, I just shimmed it up. So I made sure that this thing is good and level before I pour. So now I'm gonna mix up some epoxy. Now for this flood coat, I plan on doing about 45 to 50 ounces of epoxy. Now for the previous seal coats, I was doing somewhere between 15 and 16 ounces. So this is gonna be considerably more epoxy, and basically I'm just gonna flood the thing, hence the name, the epoxy over, let it run off the sides, and then just kind of keep an eye on it to see if I need to add more in any areas. So that is the plan. So now I just gotta go mix up some epoxy.
Now for this flood coat, I just poured it all over the top and then used a shower squeegee to help spread it out. This worked okay, but honestly, one of the benefits of doing so many epoxy pours is that I started to learn a few techniques that worked better. One of those techniques was pouring the epoxy in the center and then using my hands to sort of spread it out. I found that this created less pooling in some areas. Once I had it mostly spread out and it was starting to level itself, I just kept sighting it to see if there were any areas that needed a little extra, and if there were, I just used my mixing stick to grab a little from the bottom of the bucket. Once I was satisfied, I came in with a torch to pop a few bubbles, and then I left it alone to dry. Now, this type of epoxy's dry time was 4 to 6 hours with a full cure time of 24 hours.
Alright guys, so now that I'm finished with the flood coat, I have one more thing that I have to do here before I can call this thing finished, and that's take care of all these drips where the epoxy ran down over the sides. Now, one of the best things that I did to prep this piece before I poured epoxy was I took some of this tuck tape and I applied it all along the bottom, along the edge here of my piece. And the reason I did that is because this epoxy will actually not stick to this tuck tape. So as you can see, I can just go in and peel that off if I wanted to. But what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna peel off the tape, and then that'll leave me some nice edges that aren't full of epoxy drips. Otherwise you'd have to sand all of these down and that would just take forever. And so I'm really glad that I took the time to add this tape, because it's gonna save me a little bit of time, and on a project like this, that's crucial. All right, so as you can see, my little epoxy mixing station has gotten kind of out of hand, and so I need to work on getting this cleaned up. One thing I wanted to mention was you can see the amount of buckets that I have used with all of these separate epoxy pours. And I want to know if anyone happens to know of any ways that you could sort of reuse some of these buckets. I don't know if it's possible, but if you happen to know, let me know down in the comments any sort of tips or tricks for maybe being able to reuse some of these buckets, because as you can see, this isn't even all of them. I went through a ton of buckets and that just feels like a huge waste to me. So if there's a way that I can kind of cut down on the number of buckets or limit some of that, I'd love to know. So anyways, I've got to get this mess cleaned up, and you know, I think I'm done pouring epoxy for a little while. It's literally all I've done for the last couple of days, and I think I'd like a break. So I'm gonna get this cleaned up and not think about epoxy for a while. All right guys, I've got good news and I've got bad news. Good news first is that I got my epoxy mixing station all cleaned up. It's looking pretty good. The bad news is that I have to pour more epoxy. I honestly thought I was done. I did this last flood coat for this last top last night, and I thought that was gonna be it. I was so excited to come down here today and just have epoxy behind me, but I don't have it behind me. So what happened is, let me sort of explain. I've been trying to do my flood coats at nighttime because it's the middle of the summer and I am combating bugs big time in my shop. Now I'm trying to keep all my doors closed as much as possible, but they find their way in here, and for some reason, whatever reason, they love getting into this epoxy. So for the seal coats, I wasn't as worried about it because I knew I would just sand those bugs out. But for the flood coats, I've been trying to do it at nighttime because I assume there's less bugs flying around at nighttime, and that would just be less chance of them getting in the epoxy. However, what I did not account for is that while there might be less bugs flying around at nighttime, there's more spiders crawling around at nighttime apparently. And I know I have a lot of spiders in this shop. They seem to like it in here. And so what happened last night, unfortunately, is I got a couple spiders crawling through my epoxy, which left some marks in the epoxy. And then I have a couple spider carcasses stuck and trapped in the epoxy, which unfortunately will just not work. I mean, unless the customer is some sort of bug enthusiast, I don't think they're gonna appreciate having spider carcasses in the epoxy. So I have to sand this down again and pour one more coat of epoxy and just hope and pray that the bugs will just leave me alone. So let's do this again. Hopefully for the last time. You know what I'm not gonna miss? I'm not gonna miss moving these tops a million times because they are not light. And my back has been bugging me the last couple of days. So I hope that I only have to move this thing a few more times because I'm over it. Yep, I'm over it. Alrighty, let's go sand this.
Y'all, I was not playing around this time when it came to keeping these bugs out of this epoxy. So I decided to stay in guard for a while with my bug assault just to keep those bugs in check. Alright guys, moment of truth. Please be no bugs. Please, please, please no bugs. Alright, let's see. Okay. Alright. I am not seeing any bugs. I'm also not seeing any like dimples in the epoxy or bubbles. I mean, there's a few like little dust nibs I can see here and there. I mean, that was probably gonna be unavoidable, but you know what? I can live with that. To be honest, this top actually looks, you know, like glass, which is what I was hoping for it to look like. So good job, Sarah, good job. I am really happy with the way this turned out. And I'm especially happy because that means that I'm actually done pouring epoxy. For real this time. That means I can get this top out of here, get this little room torn down, because as much as it's adding to the overall ambiance of my shop, it's time for it to go. So anyways, that is a wrap on tabletop epoxy.
Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you learned some things along the way. I mean, I know that I did. If you enjoyed watching the video, go ahead and give it a like for me if you don't mind. As I mentioned earlier in the video, these tops are part of a bigger custom bar build that I've been working on for the last couple of months, and that's gonna be the next video that I put out. So if you're interested in how all of that comes together, go ahead and get subscribed if you're not already so that you don't miss out. Alrighty guys, I'll be seeing you again soon. Bye.